Hello, this is Bill Monroe, and welcome to 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip, let the audience respond. Early in my speaking career, I learned that timing is everything. I actually remember being in front of the room, and I made a joke or about something, and I just kept right on going. The problem was that, shockingly enough, it was apparently funny. I wish I kind of knew what that joke was now. But the problem is that I didn't give the audience a chance to keep laughing once they started. So they missed the next thing I said, and I interrupted them and sort of forced them to stop laughing before they wanted to. When you tell a joke or land an emotional point, you need to take a moment and let the audience react. That means you pause while they laugh. If you tell a powerful story, make sure you give the audience a moment to enjoy it or to process it or to feel whatever emotion it is that they're feeling. Now, there are, of course, a few caveats here. The larger the audience, the more time you need to allow for the audience's reactions to go through. When you practice and rehearse, you probably don't have an audience, though, and you're more likely to just plow right on through your content. Make sure that your presentation does not fill all of your allotted time, because you have to allow the extra 15 seconds here, 10 seconds there, 30 seconds there, that the audience may spend reacting. Don't go over your time just because the audience was laughing too much. Prepare for that in case it happens. And of course, if your audience doesn't laugh when you were sure they were going to, be ready to move on quickly. The key is to be ready for audience reaction and let them react. Stick around, and after the break, we'll see what Aristotle has to say. The speaking world is full of modern trends, high-tech light shows, and advanced presentation software. So let's talk about Greek philosophy and how it can make you a better speaker. Because despite improvements in technology and healthcare and general scientific knowledge and life in general being better over the years, fundamental human nature really hasn't changed all that much over the last 2,400 years. The lessons the ancients learned about rhetoric and persuasion are just as relevant today. So let's talk about Aristotle's thoughts on persuasion and how it impacts your persuasive style and controversial topics today. Often, we think that as long as we are logical and tell the truth with facts and evidence, people will believe us and act appropriately. Wouldn't that be something? In reality, though, that's not quite true. If it were true, there would be no need for speakers or presentations, and there would be no need for stories and storytellers. One of the first things that salespeople learn is not to overload customers with facts and detailed specifications about the product they're considering. Because facts tell, but stories sell. In nearly all cases that are out there, no one needs the stuff that they buy. Regardless of what store you're buying it in or what website you're shopping on, the vast majority of the time you don't actually need it. Customers buy stuff because they want it. Even when we talk about the basics of food, shelter, and clothing, desire drives our choices, not biological necessity. Sure, we need certain minerals and vitamins and a certain minimum calorie content, but that doesn't mean that that fine steak and those awesome French fries and that luscious bacon is a need. It's a want. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with these things being wants. As speakers, what we need to keep in mind is that to persuade folks, it means we have to engage them in a way that goes beyond the basic facts, beyond the basic nutritional requirements of whatever it is we're trying to sell them on or talk to them about or educate them on or inspire them about. We need to engage three separate spheres. Aristotle said that the truth exists where those three spheres meet. And those three spheres are logos, pathos, and ethos. The Wikipedia article on modes of persuasion cites Aristotle's Rhetoric when it says, "Persuasion is clearly a sort of demonstration, since we are most fully persuaded when we consider a thing to have been demonstrated. Of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. Persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character when the speech is so spoken as to make us think him credible. Secondly, persuasion may come through the hearers when the speech stirs their emotions. Thirdly, persuasion is effected through the speech itself when we have provided a truth or an apparent truth by means of persuasive arguments suitable to the case in question." And you can find the link to that article on the 2-Minute Talk Tips website for episode 35. Let's talk about them a little more specifically. Logos is the logical part of the argument. It's the facts that you use and the evidence that you cite to support those facts. It's the data you can point to and the conclusions that you deduce from those facts and from that evidence. Pathos is the emotional connection that you form with your audience. It's how you make them feel. It's when you make them feel inspired or afraid or ambitious or angry or happy or sad or ashamed. And the list goes on for the emotions. But when you are engaging your audience on an emotional level, you are engaging pathos. And generally, when you are rallying your audience to a cause, you are working in that pathos sphere. Now, some people may say this is all fluff or manipulative nonsense, but pathos is why we have presentations and events instead of just reports and bullet points. Ethos is the sort of least obvious of the three. It's the one we just don't think about quite as often. Essentially, it's about credibility and trust. Does your audience see you as fundamentally honest? Do they trust the sources of your data? Or do they think you are unreasonably biased or that you have a conflict of interest? Ethos is basically why should they listen to you in particular, and why should they believe what you say? Any successful presentation is going to engage all three spheres, even if we do it unconsciously. But what happens when we miss one of them? Let's talk about that now. Let's start with ethos. If you successfully engage logos and pathos, but miss on ethos, the problem is your audience won't believe you. They'll question your logic and your conclusions. They may assume that your sources are not trustworthy, and therefore the rest of your data and your content is flawed. In this case, if you are really successful at engaging in pathos, then you can have a real problem because the audience will feel manipulated and taken advantage of. And instead of just not trusting you, they are more likely to think you are actively lying to them. And that can set you back even further. Missing on logos can also be a problem. If you successfully engage the ethos and the pathos spheres, folks may enjoy the presentation, but not be able to take any action based on it. I mean, sure, they'll be entertained, but you're asking them to just trust you even if what you are saying doesn't actually make any sense to them. To be successful here requires a really high level of trust or a great deal of role power. And you don't want to waste your proverbial trust credits or the impact of your role power by simply missing out on the logos. Because long-term, doing either of those things is just not going to be a tenable solution. A lot of speakers also sometimes miss on pathos. If you engage logos and ethos successfully, but not pathos, you are unlikely to inspire action. I mean, sure, folks may think you're right, but they're probably bored, and they're wondering why they're sitting through this. You can have a perfectly logical call to action, and nobody will pick up that call. Because ultimately, information without inspiration is trivia. Well, this may be the first time I've used these terms during an episode of the podcast. I have actually talked about these three things before. Most of the techniques and strategies that I suggest to improve your speaking focus on one of these three spheres. For example, when I talk about prep work, about defining your message, about working with a SME or a subject matter expert, about reviewing your content and making sure it flows, I'm usually talking about the logos sphere. When I talk about storytelling, or painting a picture and using powerful visuals, or altering your pace, or using silence, and other assorted performance techniques, I'm talking more about the pathos sphere. And when I talk about introductions and speaker bios and following up on questions and telling the truth and admitting when you don't know something, I'm talking about the ethos sphere. So all that sounds good in theory, right? The thing is, you can actually see this play out in the real world, especially in science-related matters. So now let's take a look at some of the controversial rhetoric we encounter these days. Let's talk specifically about the rhetoric that surrounds the question of human-caused global climate change. Climatologists will go ahead and refer to science, to CO2 measurements in the atmosphere, to the size of the polar ice sheets, to the ocean water temperatures, etc., to demonstrate that humans have caused the temperature of the Earth to rise several degrees, and that's a bad thing. This is an argument that is based on logos. Now, awareness and advocacy groups focusing on this perspective will go ahead and instead show images of skinny polar bears on ice floes, of disappearing islands, flooded out families, oil spills, simulations of flooded coastlines putting Miami below sea level, changing maps, and post-apocalyptic films. This is more of a pathos-based approach. Opponents of the idea that people have caused global climate change often accuse climatologists of bias. They may claim that the scientists only take their positions to attract more research grant money and to advance their careers. They question the validity of the models and the data and more. They'll cite record snowstorms and cold weather as obvious to anyone evidence that global warming is not happening and the scientists and environmentalists are ignorant or lying. They are appealing to ethos. They are trying to win on ethos. Because if you can win on ethos, you can completely undermine your opponent's argument and prevent them from persuading many folks. Now, you might say that these attacks are ad hominem and therefore logically fallacious. And you could be right if we were restricting this matter to the logos sphere. But the question of human-caused global climate change isn't a pure academic exercise. You can say that stuff shouldn't matter and that logic is all that matters. And you might be right. The problem is you'd also be irrelevant. In the real, messy world with all those pesky people, you have to win in all three spheres to maximize your persuasion. Opponents of the idea of human-caused global climate change don't limit themselves to ethos-based arguments, though. You'll see images of devastated coal mining and timber communities, of out-of-work auto workers. You'll hear stories about regulations imposed by faraway bureaucrats that hurt the lives of good, hardworking people just trying to get by and take care of their families, while foreign enemies gain an advantage over our country and put everyone's lives at risk. That's a powerful appeal to pathos. When those who believe in human-caused global climate change respond, they often respond with more facts and evidence and measurements and temperature charts and all sorts of things like that. The problem for them is that if their opponents win on ethos, all the facts in the world don't matter because people won't believe those facts are true. The opponents won't trust the facts because they don't trust the speakers. That leaves both sides trying to win on pathos alone, which has its own sets of challenges. In my experience, I found that folks with a more technically oriented focus rely too heavily on basic facts and features to be maximally effective, and don't take pathos and ethos challenges seriously enough, because in their worldview, scientific facts should, quote unquote, obviously trump all. But that's not the way the world works. Instead of focusing on just being right on the details, it's important to focus on being effective overall and to engage on all three spheres. So when you're preparing a presentation, take a step back and consider all three spheres of rhetoric. And before you respond to an opponent, think about which sphere they're using so you can respond appropriately. Pathos, ethos, and logos are powerful ways to look at presentation. See for yourself. The next time you attend a presentation, try and identify the different ways the speaker uses each sphere. If the presentation is not effective, is one of the three missing? Think about which one that might be and consider how you would fix it. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts on pathos, ethos, and logos and how they impact your presentations. Pop on over to the comments section for episode 35 at 2minutetalktips.com and let us know. I'd love to hear from you. If you liked this episode, go ahead and share it with a colleague, friend, or relative. You can also like this episode on Facebook at 2 Minute Talk Tips, or you can click the favorite icon on Twitter by following me at CurrentlyBill. Do you have any questions about public speaking you'd like to have addressed in a future episode? I'm sure everyone would love to hear your voice. You can go ahead and leave a voicemail by calling 650-TALK-TIP. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Have a great week.